Hi everyone, welcome to the third Kant video for this week. For the previous couple of videos, I tried to give you an overview of Kant's critical system, so the entire sort of approach of his writings, give you sort of like a systematic overview of like, okay, he really did try to cover all of these different areas of human life. He tried to understand cognition, so our knowledge claims. He tried to understand morality, so our claims to know or to act in a way that is right. And he also investigated things like natural science, religion, and aesthetics, and that his method centered around what we called sort of a critical method, which is to try to determine the boundaries of each of our sources of knowledge so that we can proceed systematically and determine the entire domain or field of human knowledge. And in this way, at one point in the Prolegomena, Kant says that it's all or nothing. And I think that this is a really important point to take in. The reason why Kant says that it's all or nothing as far as his system is concerned is because he's either correctly identified the principles governing our sources of knowledge and so has been able to systematically explain everything that we can come to know, or he's not really accomplished anything, or he's failed to identify these principles and can't actually provide an analysis of how it is that we come to know things. So for Kant, it's very, very important that his approach is systematic and scientific. And here, scientific, the German word here is Wissen, right? And they would be just as happy to apply this term to like literary criticism as they would like physics, because science doesn't necessarily mean like natural science. It means like a systematic and thorough sort of approach to a subject matter, right? And so when Kant asks if metaphysics is a science, he's not asking if we can do like natural scientific investigations into metaphysics. Of course we can't. That's just the definition of metaphysics, right? But he is saying that we can determine an appropriate method whereby we can discover the legitimate domain of metaphysics, right? And so the way that Kant has proceeded so far, the way that Kant moves in the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, is to try to say that we need to identify the principles governing synthetic a priori judgments, right? Okay, so why is this mysterious? Well, it's mysterious because we already know the principle governing analytic judgments, right? Judgments based on definition, right? And this is the principle of non-contradiction, right? So all bachelors are unmarried men because if there was a bachelor that wasn't an unmarried man, then that would be a contradiction, right? That's the idea. Now, one thing I wanted to respond to in terms of students' understanding of the Hume material is that Hume understood mathematical facts to be a kind of relation of ideas. And in Kantian terminology, this means that he understood them to be analytic judgments. So why does 5 plus 7 equal 12? Well, because if you understand the definition of 5 and 7 and 12, then you know it would be a contradiction for it to be anything else, right? And so that's why Hume says that they're analytic judgments. However, I think that, Kant finds this rather questionable because Kant points out that, well, mathematical knowledge genuinely amplifies, enlarges, our knowledge base, right? And similarly, especially with geometrical judgments, these are obviously not just based on definitions, right? Because they're pointing out facts about space, right? Like, for example, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That is not something that's included in the definition of anything, right? It's a fact or a feature about space itself, right? And so there's no problem for analytic judgments. We know the principle that justifies analytic judgments. It's the principle of non-contradiction. And if you will recall the Eternal Truths essay by Leibniz, this is in fact what Leibniz says as well. That when you can resolve things into identities, that the only principle that you really need is the principle of non-contradiction, right? Okay, so we have a principle governing analytic judgments, right? And then you can also have a principle governing synthetic a posteriori judgments. So judgments that you make from experience, right? Like the cat is on the mat. What justifies your amplification of that knowledge? Well, it's the experience, right? The experience adds something. I know that the cat is on the mat because I've experienced it, because I can see it, I can smell it, I can hear it, and so on, right? And so the principle that governs a posteriori judgment is just my actual experience, right? And so Kant thinks that we have easy explanations for the objective validity of these kinds of judgments. Whenever you make them, you know what it is to be right or wrong about them. We have a procedure by which we can go through and determine them, right? Determine whether they're right or wrong. And for analytic judgments, that's going to be principle of non-contradiction. And for a posteriori judgments, it's going to be from experience, right? Now, the real difficulty is, how is it that there are certain judgments that are synthetic and a priori, which means that they're not based on experience, but they do provide a genuine synthetic element and amplification of our knowledge? That's Kant's question for the prolegomena. And ultimately, it turns out that there's going to be different sources for different sorts of claims that are synthetic and a priori. And these sources ultimately are going to come from the faculties or the capacities that we have for cognition. And Kant thinks that there are 3 of them. Now, so before I get into these 3, I've written down here at the bottom the distinction between general and special metaphysics. This was a distinction developed by Wolff, so that one German guy that Kant was a follower of, who was a sort of developer of Leibniz's thought. He developed this distinction to kind of refer to the distinction between metaphysics, which is about ordinary objects that we happen to experience, that's general metaphysics, and metaphysical inquiries about objects that we can never experience, right? And God is sort of one chief example, but God, freedom, and the soul are 3 examples, right? I don't have any sensation of my own soul as something that persists beyond my death, right? But the metaphysicians nonetheless believe that this was a topic of metaphysical inquiry and they could figure it out, right? Similarly with God. Whereas general metaphysics is a sort of metaphysical inquiry that you find with, like, say, Hume, for example, where Hume is trying to ask about the nature of causal relations, right? These are features of objects, ordinary objects that we encounter every day, rather than sort of special metaphysical object that is the, special domain of metaphysicians. Now, if you think back to Leibniz, it's kind of clear why Leibniz thought that these 2 kinds of metaphysics must go together. Because in fact, Leibniz believed that the general determinations of objects, so, the way that bodies appear to us and so on, the only way that you could come to know or discover that is by trying to understand the way in which God would perceive that object, right? And so for Leibniz, these 2 topics are closely related. But one way that you might start to think about Kant and Kant's project is as kind of justifying the use of general metaphysics, at least in a very limited sense, and denying the legitimacy of special metaphysics, so the metaphysical investigations into God, freedom, and the soul. Now, one thing that's important is that for all of the philosophers that we've discussed so far, whenever they said theoretically that we couldn't have knowledge of God or something like that, we took this as evidence for atheistic beliefs, right? But Kant is very explicit that his goal is actually to strengthen religion, especially a kind of Protestant religious outlook. And the way that Kant does this is primarily by trying to argue that the domain of knowledge is limited. So we actually don't have the ability to say yes or no to metaphysical questions. It's beyond the domain of knowledge, right? And so in being beyond the domain of knowledge, Kant is going to say that we can't have theoretical reasons, say, to believe in God or not, or believe in the soul or not, right? But what Kant will say in other works is that we have a practical reason to believe in God, freedom, and the soul. And so this is this is related more to practical philosophy and ethics and so on, more than it is theoretical philosophy, which is sort of our main focus in this class, so I don't want to talk about his arguments in too much depth here. But I just do want to say that Kant really thought that it was precisely by this process of limiting the domain of knowledge and cognition that he could actually save the Christian religion from this sort of encroachment on it by natural science. And so in the Prolegomena, one thing that Kant says is that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. And one way of reading that is to say that Hume questioned the objective validity of synthetic a priori concepts. He asked, how is it possible that we can actually use these concepts, right? And so this is a question that Kant is really trying to earnestly take up. And so for Kant, there are three cognitive faculties. There's sensibility, he'll also kind of say intuition. There's the understanding. Kant will also sometimes say concepts to refer to this faculty. And there's reason. Now, most of the philosophers that we've covered up to this point made a distinction between sensibility and reason, but they didn't really make a distinction between reason and the understanding. This is kind of a genuinely new Kantian innovation. And so you might contrast Kant's viewpoint here, where there's three independent faculties, right? And they all are governed by their own principles. You might want to compare this to, say, Hume or Leibniz, or even Descartes, right? For Leibniz or Descartes, right, sensations are just confused versions of concepts, right? It's just like when I see a cat versus when I have a definition of a cat, the argument from the rationalists is that the concept just expresses a clear and distinct notion of the cat, whereas my sensation presents an obscure and confused variation of the same thing, right? So for them, sensibility was just a very low degree of understanding, right? And then for the empiricists, the relationship is inversed, right? For Hume, all of our thoughts are just sort of faint impressions of sensations, right? And so in both cases, you kind of see that both of these domains, sensibility and the understanding, the rationalist and empiricist philosophers interpreted them as being essentially the same, but differing only in degrees, right? That if you had like a higher degree of clarity and a sensation, then it would be closer to the idea of a concept. Now what Kant does is Kant says that actually all three of these faculties are fundamentally distinct from each other, right? They're completely different cognitive operations. And while they coordinate with one another, we synthesize them together, that this is a relatively complex process, and that there's no real like idea of a blending between these two domains. They are entirely heterogeneous. They operate on two different levels. So Kant's basic picture of how we come to know things is that we have sensibility, which again Kant will sometimes say intuition. And this is a faculty of how we receive stuff, right? It's how we sense stuff, right? You think of like our eyes, our ears, our nose, so on, all the ways that we receive sensations from the outside world, right? Versus the understanding is when we come to sort of apply concepts to something, right? So, I can have a sensation of this marker, but then the next step is that whenever I come to know it, is I come to, put a label on it, right? And so I start to say, okay, I can readily identify this sensation as a marker. Why? Because it fulfills certain criteria, right? It has the ability to write on the board, right? It's approximately the right size for my hand, right? And so on. And so in this level, I have a sensation, but then I come to apply a concept to it. Kant at one point in the Critique of Pure Reason, so a passage that you don't have access to for this course, but is nonetheless still important for us to think through together, is Kant will say that intuitions without concepts are blind. And what that means is, if we just have a raw sensation, right, we can't put a name to it, we can't understand it, right, it's blind in the sense that it doesn't affect any of our other judgments, right? If I really couldn't, if this were just a raw sensation and I couldn't put any name to it at all, then I couldn't answer the question, is this a pen, right? Yes or no. In this case, no, it's a marker, right? So Kant's point here is that whenever we sense something, right, we not only go through the process of receiving the sensation, we then go through the process of interpreting the sensation, right, as determining it as being one particular thing, as being a marker rather than a pen, for example. And similarly, Kant is going to say that concepts that have no applicability to objects of sensation are empty, right? They don't mean anything. If I had a concept for a square circle, for example, then I can sense as many things as I want. Nothing is going to fall into that category, right? Nothing is going to be useful. That concept is never going to have any applicability to my experience, right? And so this is why Kant says, and I wrote this on the board for the previous video and then I didn't talk about it, but Kant says that cognition is a synthesis of sensibility and understanding, of intuition and concepts. So whenever I have a sensation of this as a pencil, and then I make a judgment, I say, this is a pencil, right? Then I get the object. I have a correct case of cognition. I've seen the object as it actually is, right? So Kant, in some ways, synthesizes rationalism and empiricism because Kant says that for cognition, there has to be a sensible element and there has to be a conceptual element, right? We need to both sense the world and come to interpret or understand it. The reason why the understanding is the faculty of rules is because the applicability of a concept depends on certain rules, right? Concepts for Kant are rules. So, you can call something a pen if you can use it as a writing instrument and it uses ink and so on and so forth. These would be examples of empirical concepts, concepts that we use to make sense of the world that we gain from experience, right? So you need sensation and understanding together in order to reach cognition. And basically, these two together, sensibility and understanding, these give you premises, right? Premises that you use in arguments, right? Like all men are mortal, right? Socrates was a man, right? These are kind of what this faculty gives you. Now, reason, Kant says, is the faculty of principles. You might be wondering how this is different from rules, right? And the key difference here is inference, right? So, reason is what lets you move from the premises that you get from sensibility and understanding. So, as a little exercise, let's do the classic syllogism, right? All men are mortal, premise 1. Socrates is a man, premise 2. Conclusion, all men are mortal, right? Or sorry, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. There you go. Okay, so premise 1, all men are mortal. So how do you justify this premise? Well, this premise is actually an analytic premise because it actually has to do with the definition of men as being mortal, right? And so the way that you can know for sure that this premise is true is by applying the principle of non-contradiction. If this were false, then the premise would contradict itself, right? That's how we get the universal premise. Okay. Excuse me. Second premise, Socrates is a man. How would you know this? Well, you have some sort of experience of Socrates, right? Whether that's through testimony or firsthand experience, right? And then you apply a concept to him, right? You say, oh, well, Socrates has all of these qualities in common with, other men, has all of the qualities of other men, right? And so you can apply that as a rule, right? And so that's the second premise, the particular premise, right? And then finally, the conclusion that Socrates as a man, that's not something that's authorized by sensation, right? It's a consequence of the previous two premises. So nothing about sensation actually tells you about this, only in the second premise, right? But in terms of the conclusion, you're getting that from the second premise, but it's not directly authorized by sensibility. Now, similarly with the understanding, it's not something that you just come up with purely conceptually. It's not an analytic truth, right? But it's instead an inference that you can make from the previous two judgments. So, sensibility and understanding together give you cognitive judgments. They give you judgments about the world that can possibly be true, right? Whereas reason gives you inferences from the judgments applied to you by sensibility and the understanding. Okay, so this is a general picture. I know that it's kind of vague to some extent, but we're just going to continue to push on, develop more and more, and hopefully with more and more examples, it'll make more sense. Okay, so this is a cognitive architecture that we have. So we have these three faculties. They do different things. One is for receptivity, one is for rules, and one is for principles or inferences, right? You need these two in order to have cognition, which is like real knowledge, right? And these form the premises, whereas this is, reason uses syllogisms. It uses inferences to move beyond those premises into something else, right? Okay. So the reason why Kant's major work is called the Critique of Pure Reason is because Kant argues that what happens in metaphysics is metaphysics steps beyond the conditions of sensibility, right? It does not concern anything that you could ever have any sensation of, at least in terms when you're doing special metaphysics, right? If you think about God or the soul or freedom, those by definition are things that you could not have experiences of, sensations of, right? And so for Kant, it's a case of pure reason unconditioned by the previous couple of faculties. And it's this pure reason that gets you into trouble. It's where you sort of start making inferences about the nature of reality, right, that have no sort of correlate to your experience at all. That's the source of trouble. That's the reason why metaphysics goes beyond its own limits, is that it doesn't bear any relation to possible experience. Now, so that's a good summary for now, but we also need to investigate, like, how is it that we get the synthetic a priori principles that we use in mathematics and natural science, especially physics, right? Like, why aren't those examples of pure reason? Well, the source of their a priori principles is different, right? And I'm going to talk more about this in the next video, but for now, let's try to think about sensibility, right? So one example of a synthetic a priori judgment that is true for Kant is that all objects are in space and time. I'll write that on the board. So, all objects are in space and time. In order to understand the source of this judgment, we need to get more into the faculty of sensibility, right? So I have the ability to sense stuff, right? Now, whenever I sense things, again, we'll do the tired example of the pencil, right? Whenever I sense those things, there's two components of that sensation. There's the form of that sensation that comes from me, that is the way that I receive things, right? And then there is the matter, what actually belongs to the individual object that I am sensing, right? And what Kant says that's really innovative and different and interesting is that space and time are forms of our sensibility. And so what that means is that for me, Kant just says, okay, look, for me, anything that I can sense, anything that I can experience, exists in space as well as in time. Why? Because space and time are the forms, they're the general structure, the shape in which I can experience things. And specifically, inner sense, so, the fact that time goes through my consciousness, right? That's, I experience representations one after another, after another, after another, right? Kant says that is the function of time, right? That all of my representations come together one after the next, right? There's never like kind of simultaneous multiple representations, right? They're ordered, they're structured by time. Similarly, they're structured by space, right? All of the objects outside of me, around me, are spatially juxtaposed to one another, right? They exist in relationship where they can be next to each other or apart from each other, right? So, just to give kind of an example of Kant's approach, Kant would say that space and time are transcendental concepts. I'll write this on the board too. I know it's a little crowded here now. They're transcendental concepts. So what does transcendental mean? The contrast class to transcendental is transcendent. I know that this is a little bit confusing, that these are contrast words, transcendent and transcendental, but that's the terminology Kant chose to use. When we say something is transcendent, we mean that it really belongs to the object outside of me, right? So Newton, for example, thought that space and time were features, not just the way that we experience the world, but were features of fundamental reality. And so in this way, Newton thought that space and time transcended the human experience, that they went beyond the human experience, that they described the fundamental nature of reality. Whereas Kant says that space and time are transcendental, which means that they concern our, as in human, possible experience, right? And so Kant, in saying that space and time are forms of our sensation, is denying that space and time belong to reality as it is in itself. And so this is Kant's transcendental idealism, is that Kant wants to say that space and time are features about us, features about how we receive objects, and this is what authorizes the synthetic a priori judgment that all objects are in space and time. If space and time really were transcendent features of objects, then it would not belong to the form of our intuition, but it would belong to the matter of our intuition, right? And if that were the case, then we could only have a sort of inductive certainty that objects of experience are going to be in space and in time, right? But that actually does not really follow, right? We do believe that we have synthetic a priori. We can be certain it's universal and necessary that objects are in space and time. It's not just a contingent fact about objects that they exist in space and time, but it's a necessary fact, right? And so Kant is saying that rather than try to locate that necessity in the nature of the object that we're examining, like I could just look at this pen for a long enough time and then I would be like, oh, I can see the space and the time or something, right? Kant instead says, like Copernicus, and in this way he thought he was fulfilling a Copernican revolution in philosophy, and therefore sort of completing the modernization of philosophy that had already taken place in natural science is by shifting perspective. Instead of trying to locate those features in objects, right, we try to locate them in our own constitution. And so the fact that all objects are in space and time, this is a transcendental principle. It concerns the conditions of our possible experience, right? Whew. Okay, I know that was a lot. I know that we've had a lot of video time for this week. Kant is very, very important, and so I feel that it's necessary. But I think that we can leave off for there. For next week, we're going to try to talk more about mathematics, physics, and what Kant calls the categories. Okay, I hope you've had a nice week.